We are back, ready for our next organ system to fall apart in the face of chronic stress. And what we will focus on in this lecture is metabolism. Metabolism, the movement of energy into storage sites, out of storage sites, from your digestive tract into the circulation. And you already know what the punchline for this entire lecture is, which is when you have excess food, you store it away. And when you are running for your life, you get the stuff out of storage, and it's all just minor details from here. Okay, so metabolism. Where do you start off with? The process of how food goes from your gut after you've eaten it to beginning to be useful to your body. Broadly, there's three constituents that you can get into food. It's protein, it's carbs, and it's fat. Protein is made up of amino acids, and as per usual, do not panic. If this is a level of detail that's more than you want, get the broad themes. Protein is made up of amino acids. You eat protein, your stomach and intestines do their thing, and what you dump into the bloodstream are amino acids, the broken down building blocks of protein. Same thing, carbohydrates are complex collections of sugars like glucose. From your gut to your bloodstream, the process of breaking down complex carbohydrates down to simple sugars. Finally, same theme, fat. Fat going from your gut, broken down to its constituent parts, fatty acids, glycerol. So now you've got your basic fuel, your energetic fuel in your bloodstream in the form of amino acids, in the form of free fatty acids, in the form of simple sugars. And we've got our first situation, which is you've got excess of that stuff in your bloodstream. You are well fed. You've got, if anything, surplus amounts. What do? You store it away. You store it away. And what you do is you store it back in the complex form that it started off in. And what we have here is our economic metaphor. You've got excess money. Most of us don't put all our extra coins, making up our gazillions of dollars. We don't stuff them in our mattresses anymore. We take advantage of the large, complex world of economics, which I understand nothing about. You store it away as stocks and bonds and soybean futures and who knows what else. You store the stuff away in a complex storage form. What do? Exactly the opposite of the digestion that you already have gone through. You take the circulating amino acids, you stick them together as proteins, and you store them in various parts of your body. You take those simple sugars that are circulating around, you stick a bunch of them together, and you store them in the form of glycogen. Take those individual constituents of fat, free fatty acids, glycerol, you put them back together, and you store those away. Very simple. So we've got this economic metaphor going for us, and when you have excess resources available, what you do is you store them away. So along comes the mechanisms to explain that. How do you do that? How does your body sense that you have an excess of nutrients in your bloodstream? How does it store it away? The pivotal hormone that's involved in all of this is insulin. Insulin, which you secrete in response to elevated nutrient levels in your bloodstream. Remarkably enough, insulin, which you even secrete in anticipation of a meal. If you eat dinner at 6 o'clock every night, 5:45, you are secreting insulin in preparation for storing away all those nutrients for long term. What part of your nervous system does that? Parasympathetic nervous system, sending projections down to your pancreas, which is where insulin comes from, all built around we are about to get an influx of nutrients and send out that signal to store it away. So insulin is this hormone of plenty. Insulin is this hormone of glutinous excess. Probably the gross national insulin levels in our country peak the dinner after the evening after Thanksgiving dinner. And we have a hormone of planning for the future. So, as per usual, along comes an acute stressor. An acute stressor where you're running for your life from the lion, our usual scenario. And what do you need to do? You need energy not stored away, but powering whichever muscles are going to save your life. What do? You reverse everything that we've done just now. You break down the storage forms of energy and you flush them into the circulation. You turn it back into cash. Hormones responsible. As promised, we are coming back to some of the ones that were mentioned briefly in Lecture 2, glucocorticoids, epinephrine by way of the sympathetic nervous system, glucagon, an otherwise obscure hormone. What are all of these about? Glucocorticoids, glucagon. They go and they take that stored glycogen and turn it into glucose in your circulation. They mobilize the storage form of carbohydrates into circulating sugars. They're doing the same thing with your proteins and storage sites. Have those proteins broken down to their constituent amino acids, dump them in the bloodstream, break down the storage forms of fat, all with this logical message: you are running for your life and you need the energy in the circulation, not store it away for some building project long in the future. You do something else in addition. You stop the secretion of insulin. Very logical, which is the last thing you want to be doing, is sending some signal to your body saying store away energy at the same time that you're trying to mobilize it. Not a good thing. So you secrete glucocorticoids, glucagon, epinephrine, you mobilize stored energy forms, and you shut down insulin secretion so that you're not storing anything. So we've got the basics here. What happens next? What's going to happen next is perfectly obvious. Our transition here from running for your life to what do you do in the face of chronic stress. And what you've got here is lots of potential for problems. First one, we go back to our financial metaphor, and once again on thin ice for me, but apparently there's this problem. You've got such a gross excess of money that you stick it away in the bank in some long-term savings account, and what you do is you agree to some deal there, which is I will put this away and not touch it for X amount of time, and in exchange I'll get this vast amount of interest when it comes out the other end. And one of the things that you also get is the possibility of a penalty for early withdrawal. In other words, you store away the energy there, you store away your resources, and you suddenly get into this neurotic, psychologically stressed state where you want to reverse the whole process and you pay a penalty. So we've got this metaphor. You store stuff away in the bank and suddenly you get anxious and you go and you pay the penalty and you withdraw it, and an hour later you decide you're not anxious after all, you deposit it again, and the next day you withdraw and you pay another penalty. The exact same thing with metabolism. You store energy for the future because you've got excess, and get into a stressed state, mobilize it, store it away, mobilize it again. This cycle of chronic stress, this cycle of chronically activating, mobilizing energy storage, and then sticking it back again afterward. What's the equivalent of a penalty? None of our biochemistry of storage and mobilization, none of that is 100% efficient. You pay a little bit of a penalty in terms of all of the biochemistry. It costs a little bit to generate those storage forms. It costs a little bit to break them down again. Back and forth you go. So that's the first problem you get into. A second potential problem is one with a rather specialized disease, one which unfortunately is becoming more prevalent, but it's one where glucose, sugar in the bloodstream, is at the very heart of what goes wrong. Juvenile diabetes. Two different types of diabetes. One version, most broadly, is you're not secreting enough insulin. The other problem is where, if anything, you've got too much insulin. We will see shortly that's a gross simplification, blah, blah, all the usual, but starting first with juvenile diabetes. In that, there's something wrong with your pancreas. There's something wrong with the cells in your pancreas that secrete insulin. Some evidence that there's a genetic component of vulnerability. Your immune system attacks your pancreas. Whatever it is, those cells are damaged and you're not secreting enough insulin right now. So back to what we saw before, which was the storage issue. You've got excess nutrients in your bloodstream, and you want to store them away, and you do that with insulin, as we heard, except thanks to your juvenile diabetes, you are not able to store it for lack of insulin, so you get, too much sugar in your bloodstream, and the places in your body that need the sugar don't get them. You take yourself synthetic insulin, and if you take too much of it, it clears away too much glucose. What you do virtually nonstop as a juvenile diabetic is you try to keep your blood glucose levels within a normal range. And there's been a wonderful amount of technological advances in terms of getting feedback, juvenile diabetics finding out what their blood glucose level is with a high frequency, manipulating their intake as a result. This is what juvenile diabetes management is all about, keeping blood glucose levels in a nice steady range. Now you got juvenile diabetes and you are chronically stressed. Chronically, you get stressed, you get over it, you get stressed again. What are you doing each time? You're releasing a flood of sugar into your bloodstream and then you're storing it away. What are you doing? The very opposite of what blood sugar control is about in diabetes. You're getting these huge oscillations all over the place. In other words, what chronic stress does is make glycemic control of sugar, more precarious in a diabetic. And this is where you see a very frequent problem with juvenile diabetics, which is, by definition, very often juvenile diabetics are juveniles. And occasionally they act juvenile, which is to say they don't do all the nice prudent things you're supposed to do with your diabetes, and instead they don't eat the right food, and they don't eat it at the right frequency, and they don't get enough sleep, and what you've got is wreaking havoc again with your blood glucose levels. All that stress does there is push you even more in that direction. So what about the next realm of trouble with chronic stress? What about another type of diabetes? Okay, so we've gotten this main pattern here so far, which is you want to mobilize stored energy processes into your bloodstream in the face of stress. And mind you, there's a very subtle version of mobilizing energy out of storage sites in the face of stress. What's the most stressful thing that happens to us each day in the course of perfectly calm functioning? Getting up in the morning, having to start functioning, moving those muscles that have been quiescent for hours. What you see is the hormones of the metabolic stress response, just within their normal non-stressed range, happen to peak around the time you wake up. Because that's starting the day with this increased energy demand. You're some nocturnal species. You don't wake up until, the evening and then you go about your business. Those hormones peak their levels in the evening. Right around the time you wake up go glucocorticoid levels, epinephrine, glucagon, dealing with the incredible stress of waking up every morning. But real stress, real big-time stress, and real big-time stress chronically, we've now looking at another way you get into trouble. First version, as we saw, this inefficient use of energy. Store it, mobilize, and you pay this penalty of early withdrawal of inefficient storage and mobilization. You pay the price there. Second version that we just saw, which is the chronic metabolic stress response, wreaks havoc with juvenile diabetic glycemic control. Now we're into the other type of diabetes. And this is the type of diabetes that is coming to haunt Western societies big time. This is what's known as adult onset diabetes, also known as insulin-resistant diabetes, all sorts of other terms for it. What this is exactly the problem of juvenile diabetes. Exactly the opposite problem ultimately, though. Exactly the same problem, blood sugar levels, exactly the opposite problem. The problem here isn't too little insulin. You got no problem with insulin. The problem here is an excess of nutrients. What are you doing? Typically, you are getting older in a westernized way, which is to say you put on weight, you become more sedentary, and you've got all these excess nutrients in your bloodstream from all that cholesterol and carbohydrates and proteins you've been consuming. What's the logical thing you would be doing at this point? Excess, let's store it away. Let's secrete a ton of insulin and let's store it away. But your problem is you've stored so much away already that your fat cells are full. Your fat cells are full, and you've got a big problem at this point, which is they can't get any fuller. Back to the metabolic stress response. What do? As we heard, you secrete glucagon and glucocorticoids and epinephrine to mobilize energy. You block insulin release. There's one interesting additional piece in there, and it's essentially built around the notion that your brain doesn't trust your pancreas. Your brain believes your pancreas can screw up readily. Here comes a stressor where you need to mobilize energy. What would be the stupidest thing to do at that time? Secrete insulin at the same time when we've already seen the pancreas stops insulin secretion. But the brain doesn't trust it. The brain is convinced those idiots down in the pancreas are still going to be drooling out a little bit of insulin. One additional step occurs, which is your brain indirectly sends a signal to fat cells, storage sites throughout your body, and what it says is, don't listen to any insulin. Don't respond to an insulin signal in case they're still secreting insulin down in that pancreas. Become resistant to it. Lose your sensitivity to it. What happens during the stress response is your body very logically, under the acute circumstances, pushes you towards insulin resistance. How does this work? An enormous amount of research has gone into it. Basic kind of biochemistry stuff, do not panic again, but insulin binds to an insulin receptor, just like every hormone binds to its own personal receptor. And what you've got with insulin-induced resistance in these cases here, which is something gets uncoupled so that insulin binds to its receptor, but its receptor, which then is supposed to send a signal saying store the nutrients, doesn't listen to it, the receptor becomes ineffective. This is a mechanism people are spending their whole careers working out the nuts and bolts of it. The main point is run for your life, and you are getting a signal throughout the body not only to not secrete insulin, but don't respond to insulin. Do it chronically, and your body is giving off signals all over the place saying, don't listen to insulin. You become insulin resistant. So here's this scenario again. You are eating to great excess, and your fat cells are full, and essentially what they're saying there is, forget it. We're full. We've got no more space. We're fully occupied. There's no more beds. Hit the road. Go to someplace else. The inn is full. We're not responding to insulin anymore. That's the mechanism by which too much stored energy, being overweight, begins to make fat cells less responsive to insulin. And along comes chronic stress superimposed on top of that. And what's the stress response system saying? It's saying, what a great idea. That is a brilliant idea to don't respond to the insulin. So you've got this double whammy. You're having insulin resistance because your fat cells are completely full, and they're just not responding anymore because they're completely full. And in addition, just in case they're still a little bit responsive to insulin, if you were chronically turning on the stress response, you were saying, yeah, become even more insulin resistant. And what you're now skating into the neighborhood of is insulin-resistant diabetes. So what's the problem there? Is the problem that you don't have enough energy throughout your body? Absolutely not. That's the problem in juvenile diabetes. You're not sending an insulin signal saying store energy, take up energy. That's not the problem. You got plenty of insulin. The problem is amid too much energy stored away, you've got all this excess stuff now in your bloodstream because there's stuff there that's not getting stored because the storage cells are not responding to insulin. So now you got fat and glucose and cholesterol just circling around in your bloodstream with nothing to do, just looking for problems like glomming onto those damaged blood vessels. As we saw in the last lecture, you get hyperglycemia, you get elevated blood sugars along with the fats and such, and they just get into trouble if they've got no place to go, and they've got no place to go because your fat cells are full and because you're chronically stressed and your body is saying, don't even listen to any insulin out there. So the characteristics of adult onset diabetes is not that you are lacking energy in cells throughout the body. They've got more than they can use: elevated insulin, elevated glucose levels in the bloodstream, often elevated fat levels, triglycerides in your blood, and stuff like that just circulating 24/7 is not a good thing. It gets into trouble, often in terms of the cardiovascular damage we heard in the last lecture. So that is a problem. That is a huge problem, because adult onset diabetes, insulin-resistant diabetes, used to be this incredibly obscure outpost of disease. This was a problem that our great-great-great-great-grandparents never thought about. As said, it is a disease becoming more prevalent with westernized lifestyle, putting on weight, becoming sedentary. This once obscure disease is now right on the edge of being our #1 killer, its consequences. This once obscure disease is slated to become the planet's biggest killer within a couple of decades or so, according to the estimates of the World Health Organization. This once obscure disease of adult onset insulin resistance is now occurring at a higher frequency among kids than even juvenile diabetes is. This is part of where we are getting in major metabolic trouble, and all that chronic stress does is tell your body, what a great idea, do even more of it. So here's this whole problem here with the potential for chronic stress to worsen your symptoms of adult onset diabetes. So we've had our theme here. Once again, you have excess energy and everything is perfectly fine. You store it away. You have an emergency. You acutely take the storage stuff, dump it in your bloodstream, and it powers your muscles. That's wonderful. You do it chronically, and you mess up blood sugar levels. You make it harder for a juvenile diabetic to control their blood glucose levels. Stress plays havoc with diabetic control, and you increase your risk, as we've seen, of adult onset diabetes. So you've already heard one thing here, one interesting thing, which harks back to the previous lecture. That business, you've got all this glucose in your bloodstream because you have adult onset diabetes and you're not storing the stuff. And the circulating glucose, the fat going along with it, is likely to glom onto those bits of blood vessel damage with the inflammatory cells. Suddenly, we have leapt from the world of metabolic disease, diabetes and such, and suddenly we're back half an hour into cardiovascular disease. And this has been a very interesting shift in the field over the last decade or so. It used to be you have screwy blood glucose levels and you go to a physician who deals with metabolism. Meanwhile, if somebody else has a problem with high blood pressure, they go to someone who specializes in the cardiovascular nervous system. And if everything goes right, those two types of doctor specialists never talk to each other. They go to completely different conventions. They have different languages. Their children can't marry. These are two totally different realms of disease. And what should be apparent by now is they intertwine. And what you've got is the kind of circumstances that plays havoc with your metabolic profile with chronic stress, increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. And the problems you get with cardiovascular excessive mobilization with chronic stress increases your risk of metabolic disease. Suddenly they are completely intertwined. And this intertwining is the rationale behind this large overall sort of catchment term for what can go wrong in this realm, metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome, in its original version known as Syndrome X, I believe, until people got more of a sense of it and it got a real name. Metabolic syndrome is the syndrome, the array of symptoms that increase your risk of metabolic disease and or cardiovascular disease. The two of them suddenly intertwine. And this is a realm in which you get a whole hodgepodge of things wrong. You've got increased blood pressure. You've got vascular resistance due to damage in your blood vessels. You've got elevated glucose levels. You've got your fat cells not responding to insulin. It's a whole connection of these things going wrong. Yes, you can have a bunch of metabolic things going wrong, and at the same time, you can have a whole separate world, the cardiovascular problems. What we've seen instead is they interact. Here's two ways in which it could occur, just as examples. One we've heard already. Have the metabolic end of problems in metabolic syndrome, have those problems of insulin resistance, and you're not storing away your glucose, and thus you are getting into trouble. The circulating glucose, the circulating fats you're not storing. What we've heard already is they are now more likely to get stuck onto those points of vascular damage, of inflammation. Not a good thing. So there we see one intersection. Another way in which they can intersect, and this represents a fascinating shift in this field, which is an utterly bizarre thing. What do your fat cells do? What does your fat do? They store fat. They get fatty. They get plump and jolly. They store away nutrients. That's what your fat cells do. It's turning out fat cells can do something else. They can generate signals of inflammation in your body. Utterly bizarre thing. In fat cells, you generate some immune inflammatory activators that are supposed to be coming out of white blood cells in your immune system. Fat turns out to be an endocrine gland of releasing hormones, signaling molecules related to inflammation. So you can begin to guess here what our second scenario here is of an interaction between metabolic problems and cardiovascular problems. You've got a little bit of damage to your blood vessels thanks to that high blood pressure. And what's the next step that can go wrong? You begin to get inflammatory cells glomming on there to the injury site. If you've got a lot of fat stored away, what's going to happen? You are having a higher sort of basal level of inflammation in your body. You are increasing the odds of inflammation glomming on to that area of damaged blood vessels. We've got a metabolic problem, increasing your risk of a cardiovascular problem. So that's what metabolic syndrome is all about. It's this whole business that you can't put parts of your body into completely separate categories. And this is a theme that should be coming through over and over. This is a theme that came through in the first lecture. Remember, homeostasis, ideal body temperature, ideal everything. And the fact that towards the end of the first lecture, I noted that there's a new fancy term going around for modern state-of-the-art notions about homeostasis, this new term allostasis, which is getting a whole lot of attention these days. And I mentioned the example there, which is, suppose you're getting dehydrated, boring old local homeostatic type solution, your kidneys retain more water. Is what we saw was the more far-flung, fancy, realistic version, the allostatic version of it is, instead, yes, your kidneys retain more water, but you begin to sweat less, you have a sense of thirst coming out of your brain. You solve local challenges to balance, homeostatic balance, with all sorts of adaptations far-flung throughout your body. That's the allostatic notion. And where does that come in here? The very simple fact that you don't get challenges to only one small part of your body. They all interact. You get a small challenge going on in your levels of fat storage, and suddenly you're setting yourself up for cardiovascular disease. What the allostatic concept is all about is you can't break the body down into separate parts, which makes perfect sense, but it's hard to remember that. And one of the realms in which it's hard to remember that is you've got some problem or other, and you go to your physician who orders up a blood panel, and out the other end, you get this array of blood test results. And a lot of us, you've seen those things. You get this long list of the various things that were measured, and then you have a normative range, what the average level is, and what's the levels that are considered normal, below the average, above the average, and you get a whole bunch of little X's on your printout there saying what your own levels are compared to the normal range, and get them outside the range, below, above, and something counts as a problem because you have abnormal levels of whatever it is, blood glucose, hemoglobin,